right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Eagle Dream's first 20-minute tech break. My name is Courtney Willison, and thanks so much for calling in, taking 20 minutes with us. So today we have 20 minutes, 4 questions, 2 experts. The topic is going to be around serverless computing. I'm happy to be joined by Scott Weber, who's our VP of Cloud Solutions here at Eagle Dream. He's also an AWS ambassador, one of the only AWS ambassadors in the Western New York region. And then Scott Telle, he's our engineering team lead. So before we get started, kind of how today's going to go, both of the Scotts are going to go through the 4 questions around serverless computing, and then we're going to open it up to some Q&A. So definitely want to hear from all of you. If you have questions, let's make it an interactive conversation. So if anything comes up that you want to ask, feel free to save it to the end. And in the right-hand chat box, you should be able to see an option to raise your hand. Just raise your hand, and then we'll call on you, and you can unmute and ask your question. If anything else comes to mind, feel free to put any questions or comments in the group chat box, and we'll get back to you. And I think we're ready to get started. Scott, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks, Courtney. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this inaugural 20-minute tech break. Scott Telle and I are excited to talk to you all about serverless today. Here's the 4 questions that we're going to cover. We're going to try and do this in about 10 minutes so we can make sure we give time for questions at the end, because we think that's where the real value will be. But let's dive right in. So when we think of serverless computing, what is it really? And I think there's a lot of chatter in the industry about serverless computing, but with respect to AWS, things that really come to mind are things like Lambda and that functional programming model. But serverless computing is a lot bigger than that. If we think of things like Aurora Serverless, DynamoDB, API Gateway, even some of the new data lake tools around Glue, Athena, the real point of serverless is removing the burden of worrying about the infrastructure from your development teams and allowing those development teams to focus on the delivery of high value benefit to your customers. Scott, do you have anything you'd like to add to sort of that overall description of serverless computing?
Yeah, I think that covers it a lot. I think a lot of times people think that it is Lambda. I've seen a lot of like Reddit posts and stuff talking about how Lambda this and Lambda this and using the term synonymously. And I very much discourage that. I think AWS, you go to the serverless page, they list like probably about 20 or 30 different services that are provided. Serverless computing it's not having to maintain that server architecture, not having to worry about doing like regular updates that you have to schedule downtime so you can get to the latest version of Windows or whatever, So yeah, I think what you said was right on point, Scott.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, Scott, around the security, and what you have to maintain. Mm-hmm. We're now focusing on maintaining our code. So now we would just become worried about the security blast radius of that code itself. No more worrying about the underlying infrastructure. So Scott, why don't you tell us about some of the benefits of serverless that you've seen working with your development teams on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, so my roots are in application development. I am a certified architect professional, but I like to stay true to the application development. So I lead teams of engineers that are writing software. And back 20 years ago when I got started, there was always the question of who's going to maintain the servers, who's going to be doing, who's going to set up Apache, who's going to run IIS and make sure that all of that is configured properly. And if something goes wrong, I'm running in development. Oh, it worked here. Why doesn't it work in the server? Whose fault is that? And kind of controlling that. With serverless computing, as an application developer, you run the same code that you're running like when you're doing the development as you are running when you're running it in production. So you understand what the challenges are of the container or whatever you're putting that code into when you're doing that development, and you can catch early on all the issues and just focus on writing code. And that's what, as an application developer, I've always wanted. I want to be able to just focus on doing cool stuff with the softwares that I'm writing. You have anything to add to that, Scott?
Yeah, I think another benefit of serverless that, I think it gets a lot of hype, and it's
Mhm.
really the cost model changes completely when
Sure.
we're helping customers with serverless. I like to say serverless takes us to a cost per click model. And, for startups, and we're even seeing more enterprises now adopt the serverless, but it truly gets you to, if nobody's on your website, nobody's using your web application, you're not paying. But with that, then also comes a great amount of scalability. We have one customer, they are routinely on a monthly basis running 30 million Lambda invocations through API Gateway with zero concern about scalability. And that's costing them, I think, roughly $250 a month to run that. So definitely, there's a cost benefit to serverless as well. I think there's a performance and scalability benefit that we've seen for a lot of our customers through the use of serverless.
And in addition to that, you still have to think about high availability and make sure that your servers or serverless applications are running in multiple regions and availability zones. But a lot of that you get a lot quicker and simpler with a serverless environment, because at least Amazon will handle a lot of that for you. It's usually just a checkbox or something to be able to replicate across multiple areas and not be affected in downtime. Because we've seen a lot of that lately, where regions will go down, or some sort of high rush of traffic will go to a certain region or location, and just everything crawls to a halt. With serverless, you can move that around a little bit easier and a little bit better to mitigate some of those downtimes.
Yeah, and I think that the scalability you talk about, I mean, there's been a lot of things in the news lately about websites crumbling under load and things like that. That's just not something that you're going to experience with a well-architected serverless application due to the underlying scalability that Amazon is going to give you with,
Yep.
things like Lambda, DynamoDB, and other tools.
Yep.
But with good, sometimes comes challenges. So
Mhm.
Scott, what are some of the challenges that you and your team encounter with serverless?
Yeah, the biggest challenge I would say from a developer perspective is thinking differently. Now that you're in charge of all the the deployment and installation of that, you have to be sure to architect your application in a way that makes sense. There's been a lot of buzz in the last couple decades of microservices or nano services, and I think that lends well to the serverless model. Being able to find, like, since you don't have to worry about building servers for each of these pieces of functionality, you can make them smaller and very isolated, and trying to think in that way is not necessarily intuitive. It's not what's taught in school typically. So just trying to learn how to build that development environment, run things locally when it is a serverless application, is kind of not normal to think about. So it's not the challenges are not over, like, something that you cannot overcome. And I think we're at a good place. Serverless is not something that's new. It's not the last couple of years. It's maturing to a place where there's a lot of frameworks. There's the serverless framework, and AWS has their proprietary SAM framework as well that they're working on, and different models that help you either run locally, or deploy these applications so that you can test them in a server, or not a server, but a cloud environment. Um,
What are
like,
some of the challenges you see around like code management? Because that has to be different in this model.
yeah, we have tried different models of using like a mono repo where everything lays in the same repository. So trying to manage the code in that way makes sense, because then a developer only has to check out one place and knows where to find all the different pieces of the application that they're working on. But with that, usually you get less flexibility with the deployment. So trying to flatten that so that you have very small pieces of functionality in each repository or deployment, provides greater flexibility when doing those deployments. So I make a quick change to the way the users handle, and I'm able to deploy that out in minutes versus having to redeploy the entire application, hours of downtime, and that model of yesterday. And that's just something that I think the serverless model really lends well to, is creating a quick agile deployment environment.
Cool. So if there's anybody listening today that really wants to get started in serverless, there's a couple ways that you can go about doing this. There's some great tutorials, sort of the typical hello world type tutorials that AWS has out there. AWS also has a customized IDE environment specifically designed to help you get started with serverless development, makes sort of working with things locally very easy to do. Scott, what else would you recommend though for helping people get started on serverless?
The reInvent is always awesome. If you're using AWS, so the reInvent event that happens every year in November, if you can go to it, great. If you can't, there's tons of videos that all of the presentations are available in videos. We've used Udemy, Linux Academy. Like there's a lot of knowledge around there and videos and guides on how to get started and setting up one of these environments. Serverless application model is great if you're working directly on Amazon, but also the serverless development project, I think it's just called serverless.com. Those are great places to start as well.
Awesome. So now we'd like to go ahead and open it up. And if there's anybody in the audience that has some questions around serverless, we'd be happy to field those now.
Yeah, I think so. If you click on, I think at the bottom of your screen, you see a participants thing. So if you click that, it'll bring up a sidebar and you can either raise your hand. And I think Courtney will kind of manage who's asking those questions and be able to unmute you or whatever.
All right, we do have a question in the chat box from Gary. Have you deployed Lambda at Edge? If so, what issues did you run into?
Yeah, I've worked with Lambda at the Edge. So for those that don't know, Lambda at the Edge is something you can use alongside of CloudFront. CloudFront is Amazon's CDN, distributes any application to the Edge locations around the world. Lambda at the Edge will be something that can actually run as requests are coming in or going back. There's 4 different ways you can handle it: as the request comes in, like prior to processing it, or as it's going to the different behaviors in the background. The challenges with that is mainly like making sure that your Lambda is versioned appropriately. And then there is a little bit of lag between deploying that version of Lambda and it distributing out to all the other Edge locations, so that you know kind of what you're dealing with. Anytime you're dealing with caches, which is what most CDNs kind of handle, is it gets tricky knowing whether you're actually running the most recent version of what code you're writing is applicable to. Scott, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Just that Lambda to Edge is kind of a specialized thing where you can, it's a good way to do things like redirection or authentication at the edge. I think there's also some limitations in terms of how large your Lambda functions can be, and even further constraints than you typically see around Lambda with Lambda at the edge.
Yeah, so you want it to be something that's quick, because if it's gonna be running when you have requests coming out, then yeah.
Yeah, so it's a lot around like routing can be done, quick authentication checks against say a DynamoDB table, things like that. But if you're doing heavy processing, quote unquote heavy processing in serverless, you're probably still going to do that on normal Lambda.
Yeah, the most recent case that we've used it is in development environment. We wanted to ensure that any cores issues were not being passed back when running a local server and hitting APIs that are in the cloud. So we just kind of rewrote some headers in a function at the edge, and that it worked great. It works well.
Okay. Courtney, do we have any other questions?
Nothing in the chat box right now. Does anyone else have anything that they would like to ask? Feel free to throw it in the chat box or raise your hand and then we'll come and unmute. Well, we do have a question from Maria. All right, Maria, you're on mute. Or you're not on mute, so feel free to talk if you'd like.
Yeah, can you describe how microservices architecture fits into serverless computing?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So microservices is a term that really became popular, probably started in the lexicon 5, 6 years ago, really came to the forefront with containers. And when we start talking about serverless, and AWS now has a serverless service for containers called Fargate. But if we advance even farther and we start looking at things like Lambda, the term that now gets tossed around with Lambda is nanoservices. So microservices are a collection of services. So the example I usually like to use is like if you have your authentication service or your customer service, right? Your customer service may have things like get customer name, put customer name, update, those types of things. And that's a grouped together set of services that represents a microservice. But then nanoservices really came into the lexicon with Lambda because now you're writing something to do exactly one thing. So that's sort of how the two fit together. You could say a collection of serverless services, collection of Lambdas can represent a microservice as well. But microservices really came out and sort of when Docker and containers became popular.
Another question from Zane. Can you talk about tuning Lambdas, optimizing the cost, cold starts, etc.?
Yeah, Scott, do you want to tackle this one?
Yeah. So AWS actually released last year the ability to set up provision throughput. So if you know that your Lambdas are going to be using for an API, you don't want to deal with cold starts. That's a great way to kind of handle it. You can configure how much concurrency you want to be available for any Lambda function at a given time. Tuning them, there's the concept of, so each Lambda, when you invoke a Lambda function, if it's not active, it actually spins up a virtual machine or a Docker container instance. And there is a little bit of that like lag in that spin up time, depending on the programming language you're using. It could go from anywhere for a couple seconds to up to 10 seconds. And so you want to keep those warm if you're going to be hitting them quickly and needing responses to be from like an API. And so that's what the cold start is, that period where it's starting up. For Lambda functions that are going to be available repeatedly like that, it will stay in memory space. So if you're creating like a database connection or getting all like parameters from some sort of parameter store or quick database lookups, you'll want to do those types of things in more of the global space, like the constructor of the class that you're executing, instead of doing that every time the function is invoked. Because once that function's in memory, you don't have to re-look up the database connection. You don't want to be taking the overhead of that every time. So you create the connection once, tear it down once the Lambda is actually going down, and make sure that you have a lot of that stuff taken care of, so that it's not invoking or running every time you're invoking the function.
Yeah, a couple other things around tuning. There's a great presentation from reInvent, I believe, this last year that really dives deep on approaches to tuning Lambda and optimizing cost. There's actually one of the things you specify with Lambda is the memory footprint that you can execute in. Yep. And while it's not clearly called out in the AWS documentation, it's sort of well known that the more memory footprint you give a Lambda function, the more CPU it has access to as well. So you can get into this interesting, and again, with Lambda, you're charged on the per 100 milliseconds of execution time. So sometimes it can actually be cheaper to run on a slightly larger Lambda because it'll cut your execution time. So there's some great stuff that's been put together by solution architects at AWS to try to help people optimize that. And the other thing on cold starts, late last year, AWS announced some improvements to the hyperplane specific to Lambda cold starts inside of a VPC context. This is a rolling change that's going out to all regions. And we've already seen some customers experience much better cold start times for Lambdas that would execute in the context of a VPC to say talk to your more of a traditional relational database management system, maybe some like Postgres running on RDS.
All right, I have
Bruce, can you hear me?
Oh, go ahead, Bruce.
I'm sorry, I was on the browser and I didn't see a place to do a raise the hand, so I'm trying not to.
No problem.
A question and comment. One, I was wondering if you could discuss the pros and cons of the API gateway versus it's now possible to do it through a application load balancer. And the second comment was, I'm glad to hear they're speeding it up because I'm trying to use the Lambda authorizer, and that could incur 2 spin-ups.
Scott, do you want to handle that one of API gateway versus using an ALB in front of Lambda?
I have not really experienced using an ALB in front of a Lambda for making it REST calls. Like API gateway handles it really well and makes everything quick and easy. So I honestly don't have much to say in terms of using an ALB in front of it.
So I can add a little bit on the ALB piece, Bruce. This is something that just came out from AWS, I want to say late last fall, I think, maybe right before reInvent. And the real reason they did this is there was a high request rate for customers that were trying to start to pull apart or deconstruct a monolith, if you will, that was already sitting behind an ALB. And instead of then having to change a lot of routes, this makes it a lot easier for a customer to sort of, take something that's already running, start to pick it apart, but not have to worry about our paths changing and things like that. So that they've enabled that now the ALB can, throw an event to the appropriate Lambda function. But I would say if you're starting from whole sheet, clean sheet, the API gateway is probably is the recommended architecture to start with.
Yeah, it gives you the ability to throw a WAF alongside it as well and provide all the functionality of the security that you need in terms of running an API gateway.
Yeah, I'm actually dealing with kind of trying to deconstruct the monolith, so that's why I was looking at it. And also because some of our functions have CORS issues, and it's nice to be able to go to one host.
Yeah, and in that case, that's the exact reason that they did the ALB implementation for Lambda is exactly what you're dealing with. So in that case, you're probably better off going that route until you get most of it converted, and then you might want to step back and say, okay, what can I gain, and what is going to be the technical lift to make that migration to API gateway.
Thanks.
All right, I have 2 questions. I know we have a few minutes left. Follow-up from Gary, since the max runtime extended to 15 minutes, have you changed the types of functions you've implemented in Lambda?
Yeah, definitely. Like that gives us a lot more flexibility in how much you can run. So there's always going to be the risk of being able to finish the job in 15 minutes. But if you're getting beyond 15 minutes, generally what we recommend is to move towards a step function architecture, which you do as much processing as you can in different Lambdas, and the step function kind of handles the orchestration of what happens and when, and you can put gates up and be able to move things over and to different Lambdas depending on what is going on in the pipeline.
Yeah, another thing I would just say is, while you can run a Lambda for 15 minutes, I tend to ask the question of, do you want to? Because the cost goes up pretty extreme when you get to that point. So, again, it goes back to sort of that cost optimization of Lambda functions. And I would also say if you're running things for that long, is there another architectural option as well, potentially around, batch processing into containers, or like Scott said, deconstructing to a step function.
All right, last question. Outside of AWS, are there other serverless technologies to watch out for? And this question was from Scott, so thank you.
I think what we're finding all the cloud providers are working on a serverless, their own version of serverless and things, that are analogous to Lambda. What I will say though is the AWS has been doing, Lambda came out at least 4 years ago, if not 5 years ago now. They definitely have the deepest technical capability in their platform. So you're seeing things from Azure and Google where they're trying to do more with that. I think it's a trend that we're going to continue to see across all the cloud providers. Again, as we start to look beyond what everybody thinks of as Lambda for serverless, because this is going to be sort of the next wave of application development, is this move towards everything scales instantaneously as I need it, and I don't have to worry about underlying infrastructure.
Awesome. That's all we have for today. So thank you so much, Scott Weber, Scott Telle, for joining us, and everyone else that hopped on our first 20-minute tech break. We're going to be back next week, same time, Friday at 12:30, and we're going to be talking about cost optimization with Scott Weber and Dustin Potter on our team. So thanks so much, everyone. Hope everyone has a great weekend.